In 1951, Iran would nationalize the British-owned Anglo-Iranian oil company, leading to an international boycott and sanctions against Iran. Negotiations around nationalization continued for 2 years, as the Iranian economy began to collapse and its populist prime minister, Mohammad Mossadeq, became more authoritarian, shutting down parliament and banning all opposition political activity. In early 1953, he began threatening the Shah's position, which saw popular support emerge for the Pahlavi family out in the streets of Tehran. And in March, an Iranian general secretly reached out to the American embassy to find out how the Americans would react to the military ousting Mossadeq. The new Eisenhower administration, with Allen and John Dulles at the CIA and State Department, was quite open to these new developments, giving the plot a budget of $1 million. Although the new administrations were ultimately the ones that approved of the operation, the talks around doing so began under Truman. In October of 1952, the Iranians shut down the British embassy and all of its consulates, which made it impossible for MI6 to act directly in Iran, despite all their assets on the ground. While awaiting the results of the US presidential election in November, the British invited CIA Representative Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of former President Theodore Roosevelt, to London to meet with MI6. The British proposed orchestrating a coup, but then Deputy Director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, wasn't comfortable making such a commitment before election results were known. After the election, SIS Representative Christopher Montague Woodhouse would meet with CIA and State Department officials in DC, making sure to play up the communist threat in Iran, with the American officials fearful Iran would become a second China. With apparent popular support for the Shah as well as interest within the Iranian military, the CIA finally tells MI6 that they are open to the idea of overthrowing Mossadeq, and MI6 tells the CIA that they have tons of assets on the ground, but the CIA is suspicious that they might be overhyping their access. The CIA only had 2 assets, Farouk Kevani and Ali Jalai, a pair of journalists in Iran whom the intelligence services would use to subsidize smaller newspapers in the country to start printing anti-Mossadeq stories. Within the military, they had Colonel Abbas Farzanagan, who had been a military détaché in DC, and Colonel Hussein Ali Ashrafi, the martial law administrator, who was close to Prime Minister Mossadeq. The plan went through numerous revisions, which were drafted by Donald Wilber and Norman Derbyshire. It was the aim of the AJAX project to cause the fall of the Mossadeq government, to re-establish the prestige and power of the Shah, and to replace the Mossadeq government with one which could govern Iran according to constructive policies. No matter what revisions they made to the plan, they all required the Shah to issue an order replacing Mossadeq, without which the operation would be nothing more than a naked military coup. Ambassador Lloyd Henderson would deliver a letter from Winston Churchill to Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, imploring him to assert his royal prerogative, but the Shah continued to hesitate. Any avenue which might lead towards the settlement of the oil dispute with Mossadeq should not be ignored, even if an attempt at settlement might result in prolongation of the Mossadeq government. Hoped in case of no settlement of the oil dispute was possible, and if Dr. Mossadeq continues in power, the US would extend sufficient financial and economic assistance to enable Iran to pass through the present crisis. Here again we see the perennial issue that the Shah had had to deal with for years, that being the Western powers ask him to do something politically risky without guaranteeing him any support afterwards. At the time, the CIA was positive that once Mossadeq was out of power, his base of support would dissipate. But the Shah wasn't confident in this assessment, nor was he confident in the military support of his rule. Realizing this pattern, the US State Department would secretly assure the Shah that Mossadeq's successor would receive financial support in the short to medium term until the oil dispute was settled. The final draft of Operation AJAX was completed on June 1, 1953. The plan would have Ambassador Henderson out of the country during the plot in order to establish plausible deniability of US involvement, while publicly his absence was portrayed as the US playing hardball in negotiations with Mossadeq. In the summer of 1953, Mossadeq was asserting more control over the Iranian government, replacing ministers and generals with loyalists. In particular, he went after a member of the Iranian Senate, Fazlollah Zahedi, a former general who had been a favorite of the British to succeed Mossadeq, and had been in touch with the CIA. When Mossadeq replaced Ayatollah as Speaker of Parliament, this forced Zahedi to go into hiding. Of the many powers Mossadeq had claimed for himself, he still did not yet possess the power to dismiss Parliament and call new elections himself, a power which constitutionally remained the prerogative of the Shah. After refusing to dissolve Parliament, Mossadeq orchestrated his own dissolution by getting 52 MPs to resign their seats, leaving the remaining opposition politicians without a quorum to operate. After this, he organized a popular referendum, where people would vote on whether or not to forcibly dissolve parliament against the prerogative of the Shah. Ayatollah Kashani organized demonstrations against the vote, issuing a fatwa calling on all Shia to boycott the referendum. On August 3rd, the vote was held, and it saw 99.9% of all votes in favor of dissolving parliament, which saw most foreign observers, as well as several domestic ones, declaring the election to be rigged. By this point, Mossadeq had already dissolved the Supreme Court, leaving the Shah as the only constitutional check on his power, and it would be this referendum that would be later used as a justification for ousting Mossadeq. The CIA's point man on the ground for Operation AJAX, Kermit Roosevelt, clandestinely entered the country from Iraq in July with a briefcase filled with $1 million in cash, meeting up with American and British assets to begin their campaign to oust the Prime Minister. The American assets began planting anti-Mossadeq stories in various newspapers, although most of these were smaller papers with low distribution rates. These journalists had ties with far-right Iranian parties of various stripes that frequently brawled with the Tudeh party thugs in the street, and were probably involved in the hate mail campaign launched against the Shia clerics. Kermit Roosevelt would begin sending people to meet with the Shah, hoping to steal his nerves and enlist his support in their operation. First, the Shah's twin sister, Ashrafi Pahlavi, visited Mohammad Reza, giving him a tongue lashing and demanding that he man up for the sake of the family. This was followed by a meeting with General Norman Schwarzkopf Sr. on August 1st, asking him to sign a pair of royal decrees replacing the Army Chief of Staff and the Prime Minister. The Shah initially refused, but said that if Mossadeq went through with his planned referendum to dissolve parliament, that he would be politically empowered to replace him. Later that same night, Kermit Roosevelt visits the Shah himself and tells him about the plot, telling him that they were going to go ahead with it, whether or not the Shah was involved, but that being involved would secure US assistance. But if he didn't, the US would withdraw what little support Iran was receiving, and warned that the army would eventually turn on him. The referendum came and went, after which the Shah agreed to sign two royal decrees, one dismissing Mossadeq from power, and the other appointing General Zahedi as the new prime minister. But there was a snag. A courier arrived at the Shah's palace the morning of August 10th, but the Shah had already departed for his summer home at Ramsar on the Caspian Sea. One of the conspirators, Colonel Nematollah Nasiri, commander of the Imperial Guard, would personally fly a plane to Ramsar to get the Shah's signatures on the royal decrees, and then drive them to Tehran, delivering them to Kermit Roosevelt at a villa secretly rented out by the CIA. They had originally planned for the coup to be launched on August 13th or 14th, but due to the Muslim weekend being scheduled around Friday prayers, they delayed their operation until Saturday, August 15th. The operation begins in late hours of August 15th, with Colonel Nasiri carrying the royal decrees dismissing Mossadeq. On the way to Mossadeq's home, Nasiri stopped by the home of Taji Riahi, the chief of staff of the army, in order to prevent Mossadeq countering their moves. In addition to Nasiri, there were other soldiers out around Tehran looking to arrest prominent Mossadeq supporters. When he got to Riahi's home, there was no answer at the door, at which point Nasiri continued on to Mossadeq's apartment. But when he arrived at the building, Nasiri was arrested, unable to officially deliver the royal decree dismissing Mossadeq. There had been a leak. The exact source of the leak is uncertain. In their initial report on the operation from 1954, the CIA believed that the chief of the secret police had informed Riahi about the impending coup. However, more recent studies suggest that the coup was actually leaked via anti-Mossadeq newspapers that the CIA had been sponsoring, with them announcing the impending coup just days before it happened. In addition to this, the Tudeh party had spies in the army who managed to hear about the plot from some of those involved in the conspiracy, leading to the party leader, Noradin Kianari, informing Riahi and Mossadeq. The early warning allowed Riahi to either preemptively arrest or reassign officers involved in the plot to other posts outside Tehran, leading to the conspirators having insufficient manpower to pull off their plan. Kermit Roosevelt and other CIA targets were held up in their safe house in Tehran, awaiting news of the plot's results. But around the dawn of August 16th, they heard Mossadeq speak on the radio, proclaiming that he had survived a failed coup and asserted that it was backed by foreign powers. It was also announced that the Shah had fled the country and was currently in Baghdad. General Zahedi, the intended successor to Mossadeq, would flee to Kermanshah, from where he planned to mount an insurrection, proclaiming himself to be the rightful prime minister. Most of the officers that had been involved in the conspiracy lost contact with the CIA after August 16th. After the CIA was told about the failure of the plot, Kermit Roosevelt was allegedly told to flee the country, and at least based on his own account, he told them that he could turn the situation around. However, his narrative of the event, chronicled in his 1979 book Counter Coup, has been highly criticized for its exaggerations, with most historians describing it more as a spy thriller than a history or a memoir. And many of the myths around the coup, especially the centrality of the CIA, have persisted in popular discourse because of it. But hopefully this video will dispel some of these myths. So here's what we do know. The CIA called off the mission on August 16th after the plot failed, which both the US State Department and the UK Foreign Office agreed to, and there were no backup plans, leading to the Eisenhower administration advising Churchill's government to make nice with Mossadeq. The CIA would ask the US ambassador in Baghdad, Burton Berry, to meet with the Shah and encourage him to reach out to the Iranian people via radio, while the State Department wanted to avoid making any contacts with him. But the meeting would happen, with Ambassador Berry advising him on what to place in his radio message, which would be made along with interviews with several journalists. In this statement, he claimed to have dismissed Mossadeq for violating the Constitution and that he would return to the country as soon as he could. After Mossadeq's post-coup broadcast, Tudeh party members began to flood the streets with riots, tearing down statues of the Pahlavi dynasty and demanding the end of the monarchy.
Death to the Shah! Nationalist and communist statues of the ruler and his father are pelted and desecrated by the fanatic followers of the aged Premier Mohammad Mossadeq. In a brazen act of defiance, the statue of the Shah's father is toppled from its pedestal. The frenzied crowds demand that the ruler who fled be returned and hanged. Royalists are punched, mauled, and kicked. Streets are a no man's land as Mossadeq seizes control of the oil-rich country.
Mossadeq's political loyalists began attacking the Shah, calling for Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to abdicate, with Tehrani radio and newspapers publishing lists of names of people allegedly involved in the plot. "O traitor Shah, you shameless person, you have completed the criminal history of the Pahlavi reign. The people want to drag from behind your desk to the gallows." There was also violent demonstrations outside American consulates, with Tudeh leaders demanding that Mossadeq break ties with the US. They also requested arms from the government in order to fight off pro-Shah demonstrators as they began to take over local government buildings across the country, demanding the expulsion of US diplomats. Many in the CIA were worried that Iran was on the verge of a Soviet takeover, the events reminiscent of the 1948 Soviet takeover of Czechoslovakia. Additionally worrying was that the architect of the Czechoslovak takeover, Anatoly Lavrentiev, was serving as the Soviet ambassador in Tehran at the time. Many arrests were made of officers and officials involved or allegedly involved in the conspiracy, and rumors began to spread that they would be executed on Thursday, August 20th. General Zahedi begins his counterattack on Mossadeq by getting photos of the royal decrees dismissing Mossadeq and appointing him prime minister spread across the country through anti-Mossadeq newspapers. The CIA also attempted to spread the photos, but they were mostly limited to foreign press outlets, which had very limited distribution in Iran. Zahedi and his inner circle were recruiting officers from bases around the outskirts of Tehran, but nobody imagined that they would be able to march on the capital anytime soon. A secret meeting in the US Embassy on August 17th saw members of the plot propose reaching out to the religious establishment for support. There were calls for the first military actions to be taken on August 19th, in what was likely to be a longer campaign, timed for just before the rumored execution of the arrested officers. Everything done by the CIA and Kermit Roosevelt after August 15th was done without the knowledge of the US ambassador, Lloyd Henderson, who was out of the country at the time. He returned to the country on August 17th after the administration informed him of the failure of AJAX. US citizens in Iran were being harassed by Tudeh party members, leading to the embassy and State Department advising them to remain in their homes. When I returned to Tehran, I was under the impression that Mossadeq, at least for a time, had won his long conflict with the Shah. I was surprised by the events that took place the next day, and I think that if they were ever published, my telegrams to the State Department will support what I am saying. In a meeting with Mossadeq, Henderson demands protection for American citizens in Iran. Not wanting to alienate the United States, Mossadeq bans public demonstrations and places a curfew in Tehran, hoping to calm things down. The conspiracists insist that this was part of the CIA's plan in order to overthrow the government, emptying the streets to make it easier for the military to take over the next day. The problem, however, is that it's based on testimony from Kermit Roosevelt, testimony which is not corroborated within the CIA's internal history. And if something like this had happened, they probably would have wanted to know. Additionally, Americans were already being harassed by Tudeh party mobs, and so Ambassador Henderson had plenty of incentive to ask Mossadeq to protect American citizens anyways. During their conversation, Henderson asks Mossadeq about pictures of a royal decree dismissing him from the prime ministership that were floating around in newspapers, which Mossadeq denies having seen, while also declaring that they had no legal power. When I talked with Mossadeq on the evening of August 18th, I had no idea that an attempt would be made to overthrow him by force. Police began clashing with Tudeh mobs around Tehran, during which the police were reported shouting, "Long live the Shah, death to Mossadeq." And during the late hours of August 18th and early hours of August 19th, pro-Shah demonstrations began to break out across Tehran, all the while security forces were busy putting down the Tudeh. But where do these crowds come from? This is where conspiracy theorists clash with reality. Most of the time when the 1953 coup is mentioned, it's mostly a footnote in stories about the current conflict over Iran's nuclear weapons program, which, as I am writing this, is being blown up by the Israelis. From most of the tellings of the story, you never actually hear about Operation AJAX failing. Conspiracy theorists use this general ignorance among the public to tell people, well, if these other things were done by the CIA, then these other things that happened must have also been a product of CIA actions. Now, some know a little more about it, but their knowledge of the events usually max out at whatever was present in Stephen Kinzer's All the Shah's Men. Some will point out that the CIA paid people to go out and demonstrate against Mossadeq. Some claim they created fake Tudeh mobs in order to get Mossadeq to shut down public demonstrations so the coup could happen. This is unlikely, not only because the Tudeh had notoriously strict discipline amongst its members, but also veterans of the Tudeh demonstrations have also said that there weren't any fake party members in the crowds. There are also reports of pro-Shah demonstrators being paid by the CIA, and although money did change hands, the total expenditure for Operation AJAX was $10,000. And so, even if you spent every cent of that money on getting people out into the streets, there's no way you could possibly afford to pay everyone out there enough money to make the risk to their lives and their families' welfare worth it. Which means most of the crowds that appeared in the streets on August 19th must have been genuine supporters of the Shah, and they most likely came out of the local mosques. Amongst the popular accounts of the 1953 coup, the role of the clergy is usually overlooked, which is largely a product of the Islamic Revolution, but we'll get to that a little later. But they were pivotal in 1953, and arguably the most important factor. As mentioned in part 2, the Shia clerics had sided with Mossadeq in their fight to drive out foreign influence in Iran, but they were expecting Mossadeq to also enact their preferred formulation of Sharia law, which failed to materialize. By 1953, they had turned against the prime minister and began orchestrating pro-Shah demonstrations. Given this history, it's safe to assume that the pro-Shah protesters were a product of the clerics, as those of January and February had been. In fact, we're pretty damn sure it was the clerics, because when news of the Shah's flight to Baghdad reached the highest-ranking Ayatollah of Iran, Hussein Burjardi, he issued a religious ruling saying that the country needs a king. This was interpreted by lower-ranking clerics, such as the former Speaker of Parliament, Ayatollah Kashani, to begin mobilizing crowds. The CIA had planned to get Burjardi's message printed on broadsheets and plastered across Tehran, but the people began amassing in the streets before they could. The US State Department, embassy personnel, as well as the CIA's internal history all described the protest as organic, with the demonstrations lasting into the afternoon of August 19th, whereas most two-day protests fizzled out by noon. As the pro-Shah demonstrations grew in the early hours of August 19th, the Tudeh party sent a delegation to meet with Mossadeq, requesting arms and that he lift the ban on public demonstrations. But the prime minister refused out of fear the US would order an evacuation of all American citizens from Iran. Soldiers that had been disarmed and dismissed from duty after August 16th began to join with the pro-Shah demonstrators, while police officers refused to follow orders to enforce martial law. Around 2 p.m., crowds surrounded the radio station and Mossadeq's home. Hearing about the pro-Shah demonstrations, General Zahedi leaves his encampment outside the city and arrives at the radio station riding a tank. It's at this time that Mossadeq gives the Tudeh party permission to take action. "Everyone has betrayed me, my dear sir. If there is anything you can do, go ahead and perform your national duty as you deem fit." Not long after, the army command post falls under the control of pro-Shah forces. Fighting breaks out between Tudeh members and pro-Shah forces around the prime minister's home at 4 p.m., forcing Mossadeq to flee to a nearby safe house. General Zahedi delivers a speech at 5 p.m., proclaiming the restoration of law and order. Mossadeq also delivered a statement declaring that he was still the rightful prime minister, but he would be captured the next morning. Zahedi's troops, bolstered by local police and soldiers who turned on Mossadeq, secured government buildings and other strategic assets across the capital. The events of August 19th had taken the CIA by surprise, not realizing what was going on until 9 a.m. The acting director, Charles Cable, would describe the events to President Eisenhower as a popular uprising that the military later joined in. Nobody at the CIA was taking credit for the events. The extent to which the resulting activity stemmed from specific efforts of all of our agents will never be known. Ambassador Henderson advised Zahetti not to harm Mossadeq, as well as to inform the embassies in Tehran that this was not a coup, but a change in government, which, legally speaking, it was. Zahetti would reach out to President Eisenhower, seeking aid to help keep the government afloat, promising to resolve the oil dispute as soon as possible. The Soviet ambassador Anatoly Lavrentiev allegedly attempted suicide after hearing about Mossadeq's ousting. A big part of this series has been me trying to contextualize the events of the 1953 coup, and to a bit lesser degree, whether or not it actually was a coup. Considering that the Shah was assumed to have the power to dismiss the prime minister at his leisure, the signing of the decrees dismissing him were perfectly legal, and thus Mossadeq having the officer delivering those decrees arrested by many is considered to be the actual coup, and that the events of August 17th to 19th was a counter-coup, hence why Kermit Roosevelt's own memoir about the events is called Counter-Coup. But more important than the semantic debate is how this myth about the CIA orchestrating the ousting of Mossadeq, and by extension any anti-Soviet or pro-Western political development, came about. Soviet propaganda outlets such as Pravda accused the US of orchestrating a coup against Mossadeq as early as July 1952, over a year before Operation AJAX, which the Tudeh party spread across Iran. And so by August 1953, the communist world was already primed to believe any anti-American conspiracy theory. However, of all the actors who are responsible for propagating this myth, it's probably the CIA themselves that are the most guilty. In November 1954, the Saturday Evening Post published an article, credited to Richard and Gladys Harkness, about the events, which is widely believed to have been planted by the CIA. This article would later be criticized by an American scholar of Iranian history and politics, who insisted that it was a spontaneous uprising. The 1960s would see more books published, such as The Invisible Government by David Weiss and Thomas Ross, which gave histories of the CIA's involvement in Latin America and Southeast Asia. And probably the biggest culprit in pushing this myth was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., and his book Counter-Coup, published in 1979 after the ousting of the Shah, which exaggerated both the role of the CIA as well as his own. Dariush Bayandor describes the fantastical logic of both Roosevelt's and Stephen Kinzer's accounts. The fact that Kim Roosevelt in Counter-Coup and Stephen Kinzer in All the Shah's Men link those contacts with an alleged CIA contrived uprising in Tehran on Wednesday 19th August, overlooking the logistical impossibility of such a scheme, reveals the kaleidoscopic or Pollyannish character of their assertions. Stephen Ambrose of Band of Brothers fame said Roosevelt's account seemed more like a dime novel than historical fact. But why would the CIA want people to think that they overthrew the Iranian government? Well, to understand that, we need to consider what the needs of the CIA were at the time that it happened. The CIA was formed in 1947, with its primary function being intelligence gathering, but its mission was quickly expanded to include operations. By August 1953, the institution was only 6 years old, and felt the need to prove itself. Additionally, by that point, World War II ended only 8 years ago, and the Korean War ended only a month before. The country was politically exhausted from war, and if there was a way to stop the expansion of communism without putting boots on the ground, that would be a very welcome alternative. Additionally, there was another boom in covert credit taking in the 1960s following the Bay of Pigs, which had discredited the CIA in the eyes of the Kennedy administration. The institution wouldn't officially acknowledge their involvement in Iran, but they stopped denying it as a means to bolster their reputation. This was before the Islamic Revolution, which made calling the coup a success a lot easier. The CIA published another analysis of the events at some point in the 70s. Unfortunately, the exact date of the publication is still classified, but it was probably authored sometime during the Nixon or Ford administrations. This report details why information about Operation AJAX leaked, despite official secrecy, and how the partial bits of information had led to the widespread dissemination of misinformation. The many chroniclers of Central Intelligence Agency misdeeds, whether in their books, magazine articles, or newspaper columns, have long placed the 1953 coup that overthrew Premier Mossadeq near the top of their list of infamous agency acts. Complete secrecy about the operation that was known under the cryptonym AJAX has been impossible to enforce under existing laws. And enough talkative people, including many Iranians, were privy to segments of the operation to make it relatively easy for journalists to reconstruct the coup in varied but generally inaccurate accounts. The point that the majority of these accounts miss is a key one. It was not an aggressively simplistic solution, clandestinely arrived at, but was instead an official admission by both the United States and United Kingdom that normal, rational methods of international communication and commerce had failed. TP-AJAX was entered into as a last resort. However, this wasn't the universal interpretation of the coup throughout the national security apparatus. The Joint Chiefs of Staff wrote its own history and analysis of the 1953 coup in 1980, which portrayed the US involvement as a response to Mossadeq's intransigence, and it doesn't mention the efforts of the CIA to convince the Shah to replace his prime minister. In subsequent years, a number of accounts have indicated clandestine US encouragement, support, and direction of the overthrow of Dr. Mossadeq. Official files, however, reveal no indication of JCS involvement in these activities. The other big driver of this myth are the Iranians, especially the clerics. The students of Ayatollah Barzani would cover up their teachers' involvement in the 1953 coup during the Islamic Revolution, which would be adopted by the new theocratic regime as one of its chief complaints against the US. The myths about the coup lasted long enough for leaders to get elected whose understanding of these events was primarily driven by myths and conspiracy theories, including that of Bill Clinton. As mentioned toward the beginning of the series, the Clinton administration had a bit of a habit of trying to resolve leftover issues from the Cold War, and strained relations with Iran were one of them. As can be read in her memoir, his second Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, had fully bought into the CIA coup narrative of 1953. There were obstacles to a new relationship, however, including history. In 1953, the Eisenhower administration orchestrated a coup that ousted Iran's elected prime minister and returned its Shah, Reza Pahlavi, to power. During his second term, the Clinton administration believed that there may be a chance to normalize relations with Iran after the election of an alleged moderate, Mohammad, as president in 1997. Using Yasser Arafat as an intermediary, Khatami and the State Department exchanged letters expressing an interest in supporting the Middle East peace process. As a show of good faith, Albright would end the policy of dual containment that had been in place since the Gulf War, in which the US tried to contain the influence of both Iran and Iraq, and to just containing Iraq. The State Department would make numerous positive statements about Iranian history and culture, but the true powers of the regime, the Guardian Council and Ayatollah, still distrusted the US and refused to pursue the relationship further. The Iranian said that his government thought the influence of American Jews was too strong to permit real flexibility in the US position. To the Ayatollah and his cohorts, we were still the great Satan, and it wouldn't benefit the forces of change to have the devil as their advocate. The Clinton administration tried to restart talks again in 2000, in which the CIA strategically leaked its internal history of the 1953 coup to the New York Times, which had been preceded by the State Department officially acknowledging the American role in the coup at a speech to an Iranian-American conference. But this gesture failed to improve relations with Iran, but it wouldn't stop future administrations from pursuing the same strategy. The CIA publicly admitted involvement in the coup in 2013 as part of the Obama administration's efforts to get a nuclear deal signed with Iran.
If you look at Iranian history, the fact is that we had some involvement with overthrowing a democratically elected regime in Iran.
The Biden administration would attempt the same thing a decade later when it attempted to restart the nuclear deal in 2023 after the Trump administration had withdrawn from it in 2018. But none of these attempts achieved the long-term goal they had in mind when they decided to propagate this narrative. I think former CIA case officer Robert Baer put it best in his 2008 book, The Devil We Know. The trouble was, it landed in Tehran with not so much as a ripple. What the Clinton administration had done was reduce America's problems with Iran to the 1953 coup. As the Clinton administration found out, this was a gross oversimplification. In not understanding Iran, Washington accepted the easy assumption that we had destroyed Iran's democracy and that this was the only thing the Iranians have cared about since. The Mossadeq coup is another prism through which we look at Iran, distorting the country beyond recognition. If you're interested in digging deeper into this topic yourself, I have all of my sources along with the footnotes listed down in the description below. I would also like to thank the channel members as well as the members of the Patreon for supporting this channel for another month. Your support helps keep this channel afloat when the algorithm or sponsors don't feel like giving the videos a fair shake. If you would like to support this channel but don't feel like doing so on a recurring basis, you could also give this channel a one-time contribution via PayPal, or you could also buy me a book off of my Amazon wishlist, both linked down in the description below. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next time.